Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. My name is Deborah Hatswell, and you're listening to BBR Investigations. I don't know what he was. He was huge, and he was hairy. I've never been so scared, and I think my granddad may have gotten rid of it. The experience I'm sharing with you today happened in the 1980s in a small village in Cheshire. It was shared with me by the witness himself, and the event took place when he was around 7 years old, and he was playing in the fields at the edge of his village. It culminates with his grandfather going into the woods looking for the creature, and there is a possibility he may have persuaded it to leave. Now, this is something our witness Paul has kept to himself for almost 4 decades. Now his need for answers far outweighs any trepidation he has about sharing what happened to him that day. I rang Paul and we had a long chat, and he allowed me to take the call. And what I'm sharing with you now is a transcript of that call. Paul said, "I've never shared this with anyone before, other than my granddad on the day that it happened. Back then, I had no idea what I saw or what to do with the experience. It's only now that I'm an adult and looking for an explanation that I got led to a channel called How to Hunt on YouTube. Steve, the guy who hosts the channel, shares people's unexplained experiences, and he tells people how important it is to share theirs. By doing so, you may be helping someone else to come forward. Sharing what happened helps you to get over it, and that's what he says, and I think he might be right. So with that in mind, I looked for someone in the UK who could take my report, and that led me to your map, Deb, and then that led me to you. It happened in 1986 when I lived in Moulton, which is a small village close to Winsford in Cheshire. It was during the long summer holidays. I can still remember every second of what happened vividly. Remember how frightened I was, and how even at that age my brain was trying to process what I was seeing. What happened to me is completely impossible, and I'm sorry sometimes that it did. But at others, I wonder why I saw him. What was he? And I remember how I felt at the time. I lived with my granddad, and my best friend Matthew lived across the street from me. We'd play in the farm fields and the woodlands all day, only come home when it started to get dark. We'd do all the normal things that kids did back then, making dens and the like. Although we'd always call them bases for some reason. Matthew was a year below me in school. That morning I left home and went across the street and knocked on Matthew's door. His mum answered and I asked if he was playing. She said he was at his nana's house, but when he was back he would play out. So I told her to tell him I'd be down at the base that was down on the land next to the farm. The base was a huge tree that at the time I thought had fallen over. But now, as an adult, I think it had been hit by lightning, as there was a huge split at the top of the trunk and it went all the way down to the root ball, exposing the white inner wood. You could see the white colour like a landmark as you crossed the fields to go to the base. We used that split part of the trunk as our crossbeam, and then we used other bits of sticks and branches and logs to make the den, and it was shrouded in natural leaves and bushes anyway. Because Matthew wasn't out yet, I decided to go by myself and wait up there for him. So I set off for the top of the village, walked down the dirt track. This is all mining land, and it's mostly greenbelt farms and fields. Everyone used to call it the Tops. I don't know what its real name was. I went past the Tops, and you had to walk through the middle of two waste grounds really, and two huge fields. I'm not sure if they were the farmers' fields, because I've never seen them worked. They were just full of tall grasses and natural plants. I remember the green sticky grass darts we'd use, and they'd chuck them at each other and they'd get stuck in our school jumpers. The fields didn't have fences separating them. They had ditches lined with trees and undergrowth. There was a certain part of the ditch that was easiest to cross, as it was narrower, and that's where I was headed. In the next field was the base. You couldn't see the base from the field, but as you got nearer you could see an opening in the tree line that led to the base. And what you could see was the white wood from the break in the tree, as it was so pale. It stood out like a large landmark. But this day it was different. It looked dark, as if the bark had grown back overnight. At first I thought this was really cool, as it was still white yesterday, and I was the first one to see it. I couldn't wait to tell Matthew all about it. I was about 30 feet from the opening at this point. I'm still looking at the bar because it held me interest. And I suddenly realised it wasn't bark that I could see. It was hair. My 7-year-old brain went straight to one of those long-haired bulls, and that was really scary. I was in the middle of a big farm field, so I presumed it had gotten out and was standing in the gap of the base. My mind started racing, as I wasn't sure I could make it back across the field and over the ditch before it caught me. Without fully realising it at the time, it was already too late. I was rooted to the spot. Fear held me there paralysed. The idea of that bull turning and seeing me was all I could think about. It had to be that breed of like a long-haired bull, standing sideways, blocking the opening to the base. And yet it was still tall enough to cover the light-coloured bark that usually contrasted white against the dark of the canopy. My mind just started racing, trying to come up with an escape plan. And it was at that moment that everything went deadly silent, as if someone had pressed pause or mute on nature. It was windy enough that the trees and grasses were moving, but I couldn't hear anything. At that age, the long grass came to about my waist, and I'd be able to hear it moving up to that point. Then, complete silence set in, and I'm just standing there, trying to get my legs to run. I've never experienced this before, and it made it even more alarming. I had no idea how to act or even what was happening in the present. My mind was scrambled. Everything tuned in to what was standing in the centre of that gap. I think I started to cry a little bit at that point. I was so confused and scared. And I was in the field on my own, no mates around me. And I had a horrible feeling something wasn't right. Like I'd done something bad or forbidden. Or like when you found somewhere you're not supposed to be. Do you know that feeling you get in the pit of your stomach when you're about to get the telling off of a lifetime from an authority figure? It felt like that. It was that intense. I told myself to run, and my head said to leg it. I couldn't move. I was stuck to the spot. I think someone once said that what we call flight or fight syndrome is really flight, fight, or freeze. And that's exactly what I was experiencing at that moment. I couldn't get my body to move in any way. I was just glued to the spot, staring at the side of a huge animal that at any moment could turn and see me. I was looking at it so intently, I realised it was breathing. I saw it in and exhale, but not in the horizontal way that a cow would, like a human would. And then it dawned on me. What I was seeing was part of a chest and stomach of something huge, crouching down on its haunches. It was a hair-covered chest from the set, I would say, where the shoulders are, down to the midsection, to about the height where a human navel would be. I saw the stomach and the chest moved as it breathed in and out deeply, and that intensified the fear 100-fold. This thing had to be huge. My friend's dad once came down to the base as the dog had come in, and he had to enter in to get him. He ended up being my teacher later on, and he was an average-sized man, under 6 feet, and he had to duck to come into the foliage and tree cover around the base. So this creature's chest and stomach area were over 5 feet in length and about 4 feet in width. And then I realised it wasn't side on. It was facing me. Its direction of view was right at me. And I didn't know where its head and face were. That terrified me. The thought of its face filled me with dread. All this is happening in nanoseconds, but at the time, it was like time had slowed right down. My senses had concentrated everything on the gap in the foliage. I think with hindsight, I started to shut down at that point. I was beyond crying. I'd reached the stage where you're gasping for air and sobbing as you struggle for breath. You wouldn't think a young boy of 7 could experience that much fear without breaking down completely or passing out from fright. I don't know how I coped with this. When I look back and remember how I felt while this was happening, I can still feel the weight of that fear. I was absolutely petrified. I didn't know what it was or why this was happening. I'd never been in a situation like this before, and I had no reference for it to fall back on. It just shouldn't have been there. It's impossible. But it was there. It was facing me, and I was frozen to the spot. When I was a kid, I was into comic books, and I read the Marvel episodes that featured the Hulk. If you used the Hulk's size for reference and turned his skin from green to a chocolatey brown colour and covered him in hair, that's probably a good fit. As close as I could get to what it looked like. I saw a huge torso covered in hair. I didn't want to look at it, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. I'm a grown adult now, and it was way bigger than I am now. So you can imagine how small I felt as a 7-year-old boy confronted with this thing. And thinking back, it never made a sound. I was in shock, completely flustered. And then it started to move. Its hands were out in front of its chest. Its arms were huge, full of muscle. His hands were kind of less hairy than his body, and his nails were human-like, dark in colour. You could see veins and how coarse his hands were. His palms were facing inwards to his chest. With his thumbs, he made a sort of triangle or a diamond shape with his hands by touching his index finger and his thumb together. Sitting within that shape was an orb or a globe of light. It was illuminating onto his hair, and it was in front of his solar plexus area. The whole time this was happening, its movements were very slow and deliberate, almost fluid. I was able to concentrate on the hands and the arms and the glowing orb of light. It was suspended by itself. He wasn't holding it. It was just there, in the triangle V of his hands. And it reminded me back then of a bright silver ball. It seemed to be getting slightly bigger and slightly brighter as I was watching it. At that point, the creature moved its arms back towards the forest and away from the orb, in the same way it had moved them together. It was the same motion, fluid, flowing, and the orb just hovered there. They were not connected physically in any way, but it was levitating there. So at this point, my mind's about to break. I was so upset, struggling to breathe while crying. It was like a million thoughts were running through my mind, my body still refusing to move. It definitely had hands. It had thumbs and fingers. Its hair was shorter on its wrists, but it was hairier as its arms raised. As you went up them, the hair seemed to get longer. You could see its muscles. It had nails, not claws. And then it started to rise up. And as it stood up, the orb was still connected, as if it was attached to him, and stayed at his solar plexus level at all times. In a matter of 2 or 3 seconds, it was standing up. What scared me more than anything was the thought of seeing its face. If it was taller than the canopy, I'd have to look at its face, and the thought of that was terrifying. I couldn't stop looking at it. As it raised itself, it moved deliberately slow, and then, from my left shoulder, I heard a growl. It was like everything around me was in a bubble. I couldn't hear anything, but I could hear growling. And thankfully, I recognised that growl. It was my granddad's dog, Hobo. He was a big ginger Irish wolfhound, and I know I'd locked him up carefully before I left. I once made the mistake of letting him escape, and my granddad was none too happy about it, and he had to walk around the village to find him. And as he's so big, people are scared of him. He's a big softy. I've only ever heard him growl when we've been playing. But today, he meant everything he put into it. He was staring intently at the rising creature, not moving an inch. In my peripheral vision, I could see Hobo right there, profile to profile with me, and he's inching slowly forwards, putting himself in harm's way to protect me. This part still upsets me, as I know he was trying to keep me safe. He's growling and looking intently at the creature in the trees, and at that point, his back leg was against my shoulder. I remember seeing his face, and he looked evil. I've never seen him like that before. He was baring his teeth and slobbering. His hackles were up, and he was completely on point. He never took his eyes off the gap. He didn't look at me or turn his head. I slowly turned to look at his tail, and it was as straight as a die. He was ready to fight. Now I know he was making himself look as fierce and as big as he could. That's what dogs do. He saw the danger I was in, and he put himself between us without thought. This is one of the hardest things I find to share, because it makes me so upset to know Hobo was protecting me. How he knew I was there, I'll never know, but he saved us both that day. He started to bark ferociously, and those barks snapped me back into reality. All the sound came rushing in at once, and I could move, and at that point I heard a voice. I say heard, but it was in my head, so technically it was a thought. It wasn't a man or a woman's voice, or my voice. I still couldn't think straight, but it was a clear thought. It said, and I vividly remember, run now, or you'll never see your home again. All this happened in a couple of seconds. Hobo's barks were so loud you could feel them, and I turned and ran. He stayed behind, keeping himself between me and it. I legged it over the field, across the ditch, and I kept going in the direction of home. I was going that fast, I don't remember running. I don't remember most of the way home. As I got halfway across the tops, thank God Hobo caught up with me, and he was okay. I kept going till I got to the gate, and as I came to a halt, I realised I'd wet myself. I don't know when that happened, but I remember realising it. I couldn't get into the house quick enough. I was in a right state. Both me and the dog barrelled into my granddad's house. Grandad could tell by the state of me something significant had happened, but I was in such a state it probably took a good half hour before I could start to make sense. I was trying to relay what had happened, but it was coming out in stunted sentences. Finally, I managed to explain it to him. I don't really remember how I explained it, but I remember his reaction to it. He was furious with me. He got really angry and was shouting, and he gave me a good hiding. The worst hiding I've ever had in my life. He absolutely leathered me, and I never found out why. I don't think any less of him for it, but that's how he reacted to what I told him. He took me to my room, and he said, "Stay there, do not move. I'm going out, and you better be in your room when I come back." And he left, and it was a good few hours before he come back. It was still morning when I went in my room, and it was after tea time when he returned. I don't know why he reacted like he did, or where he went. He never explained it to me. When he came back, he was so different with me. He asked if I was okay, and I daren't say no, you just battered me. So I said, yeah, I'm fine. He comforted me, gave me something to eat and a hug, but we never discussed what happened or where he went. I went up to bed that night, slept like a log. You'd think I would have been too scared to sleep, but I went out like a light, slept right through. I didn't dream, didn't have any nightmares, slept like a baby. When I got up in the morning, as I was headed downstairs, I could hear my grandad talking to someone in the kitchen, and I realised it was another male, but I couldn't see him. So at that point, I didn't know who he was. So I stayed where I was on the stairs and listened. I caught my grandad as he was saying, yeah, it was. And the other man said, bloody hell, Eddie, what are we going to do now? And my grandad answered him and said, you don't have to do anything about it. It's gone, and it'll not be back. That's the end of it. When the man got up to leave, I moved downstairs to the kitchen and the living room, and I looked through the window as he left. I heard the door go, and I knew he had to walk down the path, and I'd get a good look at him. And when I saw him, I realised it was the farmer who owned the land that all this had happened on. I don't know if it's his correct name or a nickname, but everyone called him Royston, and the fields were called Royston's Fields. My grandad came in then and asked me if I'd slept well, and I told him I had, and he asked if I was hungry, and I said I was. So we sat and had something to eat. As we're eating, he said, that thing, and my stomach dropped. I knew we were going to have a conversation about it, and that made it real and so frightening. I know he didn't doubt me, I know he believed me, but I was confused after his reaction yesterday. He didn't try and explain it away or say, are you sure it wasn't this, or are you sure it wasn't that? He clearly knew I was being honest. So I said, what was it, Grandad? And he said, it doesn't matter what it was. It's not coming back. You're not going to go and play down there anymore. And we're not going to mention it outside the house. I really wanted an answer. So I tried to ask him again. And he just kept saying, no, we weren't going to talk about it again. He was adamant about it. I kept asking, and he just kept getting angrier. He finished by saying, that's it. We're not going to talk about this anymore. That's the end of it. No more. That's all. I didn't push it. I've never spoken about it with anyone else until I spoke to you today, Deb. Right up to the day he died, we never spoke about it again. Never once. I asked Paul at this point if he thought there was a possibility that his granddad knew what the creature was, and if he thought his granddad may have seen it when he was a kid. And he said, I don't know if he saw it as a kid, but looking back on it now, he definitely knew what it was, so he probably did. It was like he'd seen it before, or seen something like it before. But the other thing that got me was what he did when he left. I stayed in my room as he told me to do. I don't know what happened that day or where he went. But the next day, when he was talking to Royston, he seemed clear that they both knew it wouldn't be coming back. I don't know what he did to it, or even if he did anything. But his comment about it not coming back seemed to be understood between them. Did my granddad do something to it? I don't know. And I don't think at this stage I'll ever know. My granddad passed over 2 decades ago. I even tried to find the guy who owned the farm. I looked into the name Royston, but nothing came up with anything. That's why I'm sharing it now. Maybe someone out there remembers something about the area or the man who owned the farm. At this stage of our chat, I was able to explain to Paul that I felt his grandpa's reaction may have been fear-based, and the feeling he had when he was frozen, it's just natural primal instinct for us humans. Your brain is constantly picking up on millions of signals from your environment. It does it without thought. And when danger or high emotion happen, the brain narrows down and it fixates, it pinpoints the danger. So our sights and other senses narrow down and fix on the objects of your fear. So just like a victim of crime, they narrow in on the gun rather than looking at the subject holding it. Sometimes we react with rage at the situation, at the object of our fear. Paul's granddad may have been repressing that fear for decades, and it erupted when he realised Paul had now seen it. The same way some parents smack a child for putting themselves in danger. Madness, I know, but the human brain's like that. It's all they know to do at that moment. The creature Paul saw that day was connected to that orb somehow. Was it manipulating the ground energy somehow? What was it doing? This is the only account I know of in my 40 years of research where a witness sees a creature actually interacting with energy. The fact that it stayed in its solar plexus region the entire time is important. That's the area of our self. It's where we feel grief, upset, pain. It's one of the chakras. And it governs your ability to be confident, assertive, make good decisions from a place of inner wisdom and strength. It's also the key to unlocking our personal power and building a strong sense of self. Did we humans used to do that? Is that why we've been beaten down so low we don't do this practice anymore? There are lots of reports where a person sees the creature and the orb together in the same area, or where the globe or an orb entices a person into the woodland and then a creature's seen. Paul remembers listening to an American podcast where the creature was running along a ditch and it had a globe of light that was tracking it or moving along with it. That's probably the closest account to what Paul is describing. Was the creature doing a daily ritual of self? Was he using the energy for or against something? Did it come from him or was it from the ground? Was there something about the land in the farm fields that the creature knew about? Paul remembers going to the farm to play with his mates, and there was a huge hay-filled barn, and they jumped down into the hay until the farmer found them. Every year in November, the farmer would give them use of the straw and burlap saps to make a guy. The kids would push it round the streets collecting pennies for it. And then at the top of the village, there was an old playing field, and everyone would make a huge bonfire. throw their guys onto it and watch them burn. This happened in every town and city in the UK, and I remember doing the same thing myself. Paul explained that sometimes, if you weren't lucky, the farmer had some big dogs and they wouldn't be chained up. They were usually chained up protecting his property. And he remembers a time when he and his friend were sneaking to the barn to jump in the hay, when both himself and Matthew realised one of those farm dogs was not chained up. Paul said it was loose and it stood in the middle of the farm lane, just staring at us. We were both really scared and we turned and ran away from it. That was scary, but nothing compared to how I felt when I saw that creature. I don't think anyone in my life to this point, or anything, was scarier than that experience at the base that day. At least with the farm dog, I had the ability to run and leg it. There was a bit of distance between us. With the creature, I was frozen solid to the spot. Even if someone had paid me, I wouldn't have been able to get away. It was a completely paralysing experience. I couldn't move a muscle. I'm just glad I didn't see its face. That'd have been too much for me. And even to this day, I'm grateful I never saw it. I don't know what would have happened if Hobo hadn't shown up and protected me. I never went back there. And even now, I'm nervous about doing so. So I've made arrangements and I offered to go to the area with Paul in the next few days while he returns to the base. And for all the small village has far more houses than it had before, it's still an area that hugs the greenbelt land. Paul gave me lots of background information, and I asked about any possible mine works in the area, along with the usual places that crop up in these sighting reports, golf courses, railway lines, rivers. The area itself is or was part of the Winsford salt mine, and that may possibly have been the attraction all along. But I think I need to do some digging and see what was on the land way before the village or the mine was established. It's an area where the ley line converges, which tells me there's a connection to the land energy in some way. Paul's family played and worked in the same areas as children and adults going back generations, and it may be that he tuned into something that day on the field, tuned into an experience that's plagued him throughout his life. Like me and many of the other witnesses, the need for answers far outweighs the potential ridicule that may come with speaking out about what happened. And Paul was happy for me to use his name, as he's hoping for some answers into what he saw that day. And what was the creature doing with that silver energy orb? I've long theorised that cryptids have a connection to magnetic earth energy. I think all phenomena does. Does it enable things to move between quantum planes? Is it an inbuilt ability that we see as magical? Could as humans used to do it? We ground ourselves, we feel better. We cure illness when we ground ourselves. There are people on this earth who can do the same thing. They can harness and manipulate energy. Is it within all of us, just waiting to be unlocked? Imagine how strong we'd be if we could all do that. Whilst we were chatting, I was tempted to ask about any other experiences Paul may have had that had come under the title of unexplained, but I held off until he'd finished explaining what happened to him that day. And he advised me that there are other unexplained events and that's something he and I can discuss going forward. I was able to share some experiences that were very similar to his that took place on Greenbelt land that's riddled with old mine tunnels. Does the mining affect the earth energy? Is the ground disturbance bringing something forth or attracting it in some way? Like when renovations bring spirit energy to the surface and, once calm houses become the centre of paranormal activity. Another example is when we build on ancient fairy sites or burial places. If Paul's granddad did know of this creature, then it's been around for at least 2 generations that we know of, and possibly even more. The constant mining may have disturbed something, or opened a portal of some kind. And there may still be people in the village and surrounding towns who have their own experiences, never shared before. Or they know a story within their family history that could tie into Paul's experience. And both myself and Paul are hoping that sharing this experience will bring them the courage it takes to share their events too. Every day now, I take another report from this beautiful island from an ordinary person who sees the impossible. They come from all walks of life. Status or wealth doesn't set you apart. These events happen to all ages, from small children right through to the elderly. The report I took last week happened to an 88-year-old man, experienced the paranormal for the first time. And no doubt tomorrow there'll be another case that defies explanation. Standing up in a crowded room and speaking your truth sometimes feels impossible. But I found that when I did this, people all around the room stood up with me, shared their experience for the first time. It was an honour and a privilege bringing Paul's truth into the public eye. And just knowing he was able to share everything with me without judgment made things a little easier for him. I'll keep in touch with him, and I'll of course bring you any updates as they come in. If you're in the local area and have information to share, we can't wait to hear from you. Or if you have any information on the energy ball or ground energy manipulation, I would love to hear from you. I hope you enjoyed tonight's episode, and I'll be back next week with another. Every day now, the BBR case files get bigger and bigger. But that tells me there's an army of us now, each with our own need for answers, marching on the naysayers and sharing our truths, whatever they are. Remember, freedom of thought and speech is a given. It's one of our last rights in a world where we're governed more and more by the powers that be. It might just be time for you to join our ranks, walk further into the future with us, as we make a place that's inclusive to all, regardless of experience. One foot in front of the other, one step at a time. Good night, everyone. Are you a member of a paranormal or cryptid investigation team looking for cases or areas to investigate? Are you a TV company or filmmaker looking for location areas and witness testimony? Or a podcaster looking for a guest for the show? Then BBR can help with that. With access to over 5,000 exclusive case files, all listed on an interactive map, we can put you in the perfect spot or find the perfect case for you. Here at BBR, we have a huge database of information not known in the public forum. So use the links below in the description and get in touch today. My name's Deborah Hatswell, and you've been listening to BBR Investigations.